All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to get into something that I know a lot of you learners out there probably thinking about a lot,
Yeah.
and that's really understanding how university students learn best, how they study effectively.
Right.
It's a big topic, right? We all want to get the most out of our learning, especially in a university setting where there's so much information coming at you all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of our listeners are probably like me. They're the kind of people who really want to dive deep. Like they want to understand the material. They want to get to those aha moments, but they also don't want to get bogged down in a ton of extra details, you know? They
Mhm.
want to get to the core insights quickly.
Exactly, exactly. So that's kind of the mission of this deep dive today. We want to cut through all the research out there on student learning and higher education and give you guys, the learners, the most important takeaways, the stuff that really matters.
Yeah, kind of like a shortcut to really being informed, without having to read through tons and tons of research articles.
Precisely. And to do that, we've looked at a bunch of different sources, but a key one we're going to be drawing from is a 2004 article from the Educational Psychology Review. It's called Aspects and Prospects of Measuring Studying and Learning in Higher Education.
Long title.
Yeah, kind of a mouthful. But it's by Lonka, Okanuora, and Mekinen, and it's a really great overview of the field. It talks about all the different ways researchers have tried to understand student learning, and it kind of lays out the landscape of where the key ideas come from. So over the course of our conversation, we're going to unpack the big picture of how researchers understand student learning. We'll touch on the crucial difference between actually understanding the material, like deeply getting it, versus just memorizing stuff, right?
Right.
And we'll explore how your own motivation, your own ability to kind of guide your learning plays a huge role in that. Plus, we'll look at how the environment you're learning in, like the actual university or classroom setting, can shape how you approach your studies. So, much to cover.
Yeah, a lot to unpack here.
Where do we even begin with all this research? It seems like such a massive field.
Well, this 2004 article that we're going to be looking at, it actually does a really good job of highlighting that there are like these three main lines of research, these three big ways that people have thought about student learning in higher education. So one of the first ones, and this came mostly out of European research, is called Students' Approaches to Learning, or SAL for short. And SAL researchers were really interested in understanding the different ways that students experience and go about their learning. Like, how do they actually approach a learning task? What's their process like? What are they feeling and thinking? So it's really about the quality of that experience, not just what they do, but how they experience it.
Okay, so that's the European angle, really focused on the student's own direct experience. What about the second big perspective?
Yeah, so the second one, which has been a little more dominant, I would say, in North American research, is called information processing, or IP. And this often goes hand in hand with the idea of self-regulated learning, or SRL. So the IP approach, it really dives into the nuts and bolts of the mental processes that are involved in learning. Like, what are the specific cognitive strategies you're using when you're trying to understand a concept or solve a problem? And then SRL, which researcher Pintrich argues is actually a better term, really emphasizes how students manage and take control of their own learning. Like, how do you monitor your progress? How do you set goals? How do you adjust your strategies when things aren't working? So Pintrich is a really central figure in this area.
Okay, so we've got the European focus on the lived experience,
Yeah.
and then a more North American focus on the mechanics of learning, the strategies, and how students can actually steer their own learning. But the article kind of hints that these aren't the whole story, right? There's more to it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, those two have been hugely influential, but there's this growing awareness that we need a broader view, a bigger perspective. And part of that is looking at, what actually motivates students? Like, what drives them to learn in the first place? Why are they even in university, right? And how does that motivation shape how they approach their studies? And then the other part of that broader perspective is thinking about the cultural context of learning. Like, learning isn't just this individual thing happening in your head. It's also shaped by the social and cultural factors around you.
Absolutely, yeah. It makes total sense that those things would play a role. So let's dive into that first area, the students' approaches to learning, or SEL. You mentioned Martin and Celia. Those were some of the key researchers there. What was like the big discovery they made early on in this field?
Yeah, so back in 1976, Martin and Celia, they made this really crucial distinction between what they called deep learning and surface learning. And this has been like super influential in how people think about student learning. So deep learning is basically when you're focused on truly understanding the material. You're not just trying to memorize facts and figures. You're really trying to grasp the meaning, to connect ideas, to see how it all fits together, to get to the essence of what you're learning.
Right. It's like the difference between like really knowing something versus just being able to parrot it back.
Exactly, exactly. And then surface learning, as the name implies, is more about like rote memorization. You're just trying to remember the details, the facts, maybe just enough to pass a test, but you're not really trying to understand it deeply or how it connects to other things.
So it's more about reproduction than like actual comprehension.
Right, exactly. And what's really interesting about the Cell tradition is that it started by really trying to understand learning from the student's own point of view. So instead of just observing their behavior or trying to measure their performance, they actually wanted to know, like, what does it feel like to learn for the student? What's their experience?
So getting into their heads, understanding their perspective.
Exactly. Yeah. And they did this a lot through interviews. Like they would sit down with students and have these in-depth conversations about their learning experiences.
Makes sense.
Yeah. And then based on what they learned from those conversations, they would develop these questionnaires, these surveys that they could give to larger groups of students to kind of measure these different approaches to learning.
Okay, so it starts with talking to students,
Yeah.
really understanding their perspective, and then it moves to trying to like quantify that, measure it on a larger scale.
Exactly. It's a really interesting approach, and it's become pretty common in this field.
Yeah, and the article mentions a bunch of different questionnaires that have been developed over the years. There's the approaches to studying inventory, or ASI-FA by Entwistle and Ramsden, and the study process questionnaire, or SBQ by Biggs, and there's a whole bunch more, like the Rossi, the ASSIST. It seems like everyone's got their own acronym.
It's an alphabet soup of learning questionnaires.
Yeah, exactly. But across all these different ways of measuring learning,
Yeah.
did that core idea of deep versus surface learning, did that still hold up as being important?
Yeah, absolutely. The article really stresses that Martin and Salyu's initial distinction between deep and surface learning, it's kind of remained the central, enduring idea. And even though the specific questions and how they measure it might be a little different across the different questionnaires, they all kind of come back to this fundamental difference between, like, are you trying to really understand something deeply, or are you just trying to get by on the surface?
So even with all these different acronyms and ways of measuring, it still comes back to that core idea.
Yeah, it's really stuck around. And I think for you as a learner, it's a good reminder that, focusing on that deep comprehension, on really trying to understand things, is going to be key for long-term learning and retention.
Makes sense. Now, the article also mentions that a third way of approaching learning emerged, not just deep or surface, but something else. What was that?
Yeah, so a lot of researchers started to notice that there was this other approach that didn't quite fit into deep or surface, and they called it the achieving approach, or sometimes the strategic approach. And this is basically when the student's main focus is on getting good grades, on achieving academic success. They're really organized, they manage their time well, they're good at figuring out what the professor wants, and they kind of play the academic game well to get those good results.
So it's less about the material itself and more about the outcome, about getting that A.
Exactly. It's about the strategy, about being efficient and effective in achieving those external markers of success.
Interesting. And how does this achieving approach relate to deep and surface learning?
Yeah, so the deep and surface approaches are really about how you're engaging with the actual content, the actual learning material. Whereas the achieving approach is more about how you're managing your overall study process. And research suggests that, while being strategic can definitely help you get good grades, it's often most effective when it's combined with a deep approach. Like if you can truly understand the material and also be smart about how you study, that's kind of a recipe for success.
Makes sense. So you're not just memorizing to get the A, you're understanding it, but you're also being strategic about how you approach your learning.
Exactly. Yeah, it's kind of like having the best of both worlds.
Now, the article also touches on how these learning approaches relate to students' broader ideas about like what learning and knowledge even are. How do those things connect?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's kind of like, what's your underlying philosophy of learning? What do you believe about knowledge? And research shows that those beliefs can actually shape how you approach your studies. So for instance, if you think that learning is just about absorbing information, kind of like a sponge, you're more likely to use those surface level strategies, just trying to soak up the facts. But if you see learning as more of an active process, like you're building your own understanding, you're constructing meaning, then you're probably going to lean more towards those deeper approaches.
So your beliefs about learning, they kind of act like a mental framework that guides how you make sense of the whole process.
Exactly, yeah. It's like a lens through which you view learning.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's not just these general beliefs, right? It's also the specific situation you're in that can affect how you apply these approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're not robots, right? We don't just apply the same approach in every situation. So things like your motivation, your emotions, the particular task you're facing, all of those things can influence how you put those more general tendencies into practice.
So you might generally prefer to understand things deeply, but if you've got a test tomorrow and it's all about memorizing dates and names, you might, out of necessity, use a more surface level approach.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to adapt to the situation.
The article also uses the terms orientations and styles to describe a tendency to use a particular approach across different situations. What's the nuance there?
Yeah, so orientations and styles, they kind of suggest this more consistent, stable pattern of learning. So if a student consistently uses a deep approach across different courses and different tasks, they might be described as having a meaning orientation. They're really oriented toward understanding and making meaning. Whereas if a student tends to prefer those surface level strategies in most situations, they might be labeled as having a reproducing orientation. They're more focused on like just reproducing the information.
Okay, so approaches are more adaptable, but it can change depending on the situation, but orientations or styles suggest something more ingrained, more habitual.
Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned earlier that the SAL tradition, it often starts by actually talking to students,
Yeah.
having those in-depth interviews, and the article calls this a two-step methodology. Why is that significant? Why start with those conversations?
Yeah, so the idea is that you want to make sure that the way you're measuring learning, like through those questionnaires, that it's actually grounded in how students themselves experience it. So you start by having those conversations, you analyze those experiences, you identify those key themes, and then you use that to develop your measurement tools.
So it's like you're not just coming up with theories in a vacuum.
Yeah,
You're actually basing it on real student experiences.
exactly.
The article also points out a distinction that the researcher Biggs made between the SO approach and the IP approach. Can you explain that a little bit?
Right. Yeah, so Biggs kind of suggested that the SL approach, because it's based on students' own descriptions of their learning, it really focuses on their conscious awareness of their study methods. Like, what are they consciously doing when they're studying? Whereas the IP approach, at least originally, it was more interested in analyzing the actual cognitive processes that are happening during learning, often through experiments. So it's kind of like SAL is more about what students are aware of doing, and IP is more about what's happening in their brains, even if they're not consciously aware of it.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about the term learning style? The article kind of says that it's, somewhat problematic. What's the issue with that term?
Yeah, so the issue with learning style, particularly as it was used by, researcher Pask and some others, is that it often implies this fixed general way that someone learns. Like, you're either this type of learner or that type of learner, and that's just how you are. And that can be really limiting because it doesn't account for the fact that people can adapt their approaches, that they can learn in different ways depending on the situation. And the SL tradition, while acknowledging learning orientations, it tends to focus more on how students approach specific learning tasks and how those approaches can change and evolve.
Okay, so it's not about putting people in boxes and saying, you're this type of learner, end of story.
Right, it's more nuanced than that.
All right, so we've got a good grasp, I think, on the SL tradition. Now let's shift gears and talk about the second major perspective, the information processing, or as it's often called now, self-regulated learning tradition. What's the main emphasis here?
Yeah, so the SRL tradition, it really shifts the focus to the actual study strategies that students use and how those strategies connect to their learning processes and outcomes. And a really central idea here is this idea of metacognition, which is basically thinking about your own thinking. Like being aware of how you learn, being able to monitor and control your learning effectively.
So it's not just about what you know, but about knowing how you know it and how to learn it better.
Exactly, yeah. It's about that self-awareness and that ability to kind of direct your own learning. And as the article points out, Pinterich really championed this term, self-regulated learning, as a more accurate way to describe this than just information processing. Because SRL really emphasizes that active role that you, the learner, play in managing your own motivation, your own learning behaviors, and your own cognitive processes during learning.
Right, you're not just passively receiving information, you're actively involved in shaping how you learn. And Pinterich actually developed a way to assess this, right? The MSLQ.
Yeah, the Motivated Strategies for Learning questionnaire, that's a really big one in this field. And it's designed to measure both like how motivated students are and also how well they use these self-regulated learning strategies in their college courses. So it looks at things like rehearsal, which is basically just repeating information to yourself, elaboration, which is connecting new information to what you already know, organization, which is structuring the material in a logical way, and then metacognition, which is that planning, monitoring, and adjusting your learning. And it even looks at things like critical thinking, which is using what you know to evaluate new information and form judgments.
So it's a pretty comprehensive look at the mental toolkit that students are using.
Yeah, it really tries to capture the different strategies and processes involved.
Now, how does this IPSRL tradition relate to the IFEXAL tradition that we talked about earlier? Like, are they totally separate things, or do they connect somehow?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, while they started from different places, these two ways of thinking about learning are definitely linked. So the way you approach learning, like from that SL perspective, whether you're trying to understand deeply or just memorize, that can directly influence the specific techniques and strategies you actually use, which is the focus of SRL.
So your overall goal, your intention in learning, it shapes the tools you choose to use.
Exactly. Yeah. Like if you're aiming for deep understanding, you're more likely to use those elaboration and organization strategies, right? You're going to try to connect the dots, you're going to try to structure the information. But if you're just trying to get by, you might rely more on just rehearsal, just repeating things over and over. And the research also shows that there's this interesting interplay between like what students believe about learning and how they actually study. So if you believe that learning is about understanding, you're more likely to choose strategies that actually help you understand. And similarly, your mental model of learning, like whether you see it as actively constructing knowledge or just passively receiving it, that's also connected to the kinds of strategies you prefer.
It's all connected, right? Your beliefs, your goals, your strategies.
Exactly.
The article also touches on something called personal epistemologies. What are those, and how do they fit into this picture?
Yeah, so personal epistemologies is kind of a fancy term, but it basically refers to your beliefs about the nature of knowledge and knowing. Like, what do you believe knowledge is? Do you think it's fixed and certain, or is it constantly changing and evolving? Do you believe it comes from authority figures, or does it come from your own experiences and reasoning? And these beliefs, they can also influence how you approach learning, especially those more complex learning tasks.
So, like, if you think knowledge is absolute and unchanging, you might be less inclined to question things or to look for alternative perspectives.
Yeah, exactly. But if you have more of a constructivist view of knowledge, you're probably going to be more inclined to think critically, to seek out different viewpoints, to really engage with the material.
It seems like it's all pointing towards this more holistic, connected way of understanding learning. The article talks about a systemic approach. What does that involve?
A systemic approach, it basically emphasizes that learning doesn't happen in isolation. It's part of this bigger system that includes the learning environment, the teaching methods that are being used, the way learning is assessed. All of these things interact and influence both how you learn and what you get out of it.
Right. It's not just about the individual student. It's about the whole context.
Exactly.
And there are even models that try to, like, put all these pieces together.
Right.
The article mentions one by Butler and Wynn.
Yeah, Butler and Wynn's model is a really good example of that. It kind of gives us a way to see self-regulated learning as this whole process. It looks at how learners interpret tasks, how they set goals for themselves, how they use different strategies, how they monitor their progress, how they use feedback, all within the context of their existing knowledge and beliefs. And Pinterich also has a really detailed model of the different stages and areas of SRL, which further highlights how complex this process really is.
So it's like you, the learner, are at the center of this system, but you're constantly interacting with the task, with the environment, with your own beliefs and motivations.
Exactly. It's this dynamic interplay of all these different factors.
And running through a lot of this research is this idea of self-efficacy, right? Like
Yeah.
your belief in your own ability to succeed.
Yeah, self-efficacy is huge. It's basically how confident you feel about your ability to handle a particular learning challenge. And research shows that the more confident you are, the more likely you are to persist, to put in the effort, to use effective strategies, and ultimately to succeed.
So it's not just about having the skills, it's also about believing in yourself.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a big part of the puzzle.
Okay, so we've covered those two main research traditions, the SAL and the SRL. Now, the article kind of moves into looking at student learning from an even broader perspective. And it actually questions some of the common assumptions that have been made in this field. One of those is whether that deep approach to learning is always the best or the only good way to learn. What's the more nuanced view?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and it's something that researchers are starting to really grapple with. So, deep learning has often been seen as the ideal, right? Like that's what we want all students to do to really understand the material, but there's this emerging recognition that it might not always be the most efficient or even the most helpful approach for every student in every situation.
So deep learning is good, but maybe not always the be-all and end-all.
Exactly. Like the article mentions some research showing that students who are very focused on their future careers, they want to get out there and start working, they might actually progress faster through their studies. And sometimes getting too caught up in the deep understanding can actually slow you down if you don't also have that drive to complete, to achieve, to move forward.
So it's like being too deep without also being strategic could actually backfire.
Yeah, potentially. And there's also some research suggesting that the achieving approach, that focus on getting good grades, might actually be more important than we thought for things like sticking with your studies, for persistence, especially in fields like the humanities, where there's not always this clear career path laid out for you.
Okay, so being strategic can actually help you stay motivated and reach the finish line.
Yeah, it can provide that extra bit of structure and direction.
The article also brings up the increasing importance of collaborative learning in today's, educational landscape. How does that fit into these more traditional ways of understanding learning?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something that, the field is still trying to figure out. A lot of the older questionnaires and ways we've had of measuring learning, they tend to focus on studying as this solitary activity. Like you're sitting at your desk by yourself, reading your textbook, taking notes. But in reality, students learn together all the time, right? They form study groups, they discuss ideas, they help each other out.
Yeah, absolutely. Collaboration is a huge part of learning, especially in university.
Exactly. And so researchers are starting to realize that, our ways of measuring learning haven't always captured that social dimension very well.
Right, so even though we know it's important, we haven't always had the tools to really study it effectively.
Exactly.
Now, this seems to be leading to some new ideas and new research. The article mentions the collaborative constructivist view. What's that all about?
Yeah, so the collaborative constructivist view, it basically recognizes that learning isn't just about you as an individual constructing your own understanding. It's also about this social process of creating shared understanding through working with others. So you're not just building your own knowledge, you're collaborating to build meaning together.
So, learning becomes more of a social activity.
Exactly. And this kind of challenges some of those traditional assumptions about learning being this purely individual thing. And it also suggests that, we might need to look even more closely at that deep approach and consider, like, is it more focused on individual understanding or is it about understanding that's built through collaboration?
It sounds like the field is constantly evolving and adapting to the changing ways education is happening.
Yeah, definitely. There's always new research and new ideas emerging.
The article also really emphasizes this dynamic interaction between the student and the learning environment.
hmm
How does that interplay affect how we learn?
Yeah, that's super important. So research shows that the way teachers teach can actually have a big impact on how students learn. If the teaching is very teacher-focused, where the instructor is the main source of information, students are more likely to adopt those surface-level, memorization-based approaches. But when teachers use more student-centered methods, where they encourage active participation, critical thinking, discussion, problem-solving, students are more likely to engage in deeper learning.
So the environment can either encourage deep learning
hmm
or unintentionally push you towards just rote memorization.
Yeah, exactly. And individual students or even groups of students, they might develop their own unique kind of orchestrations of learning. Like they figure out how to navigate the learning environment, how to meet the demands of the course, how to achieve their goals. And sometimes those orchestrations can be kind of disintegrated or dissonant, meaning they involve these conflicting approaches, and that can make learning more difficult. Like if your preferred way of learning clashes with what the course expects of you, that can create friction.
So you're trying to balance your own preferences with the demands of the environment.
Exactly. And then there's also the role of regulation. So both your own self-regulation, like how well you can manage your own learning, and also how the teacher regulates the course.
Right, how much structure they provide.
Exactly. And the interaction between those two things can either work really well or it can create friction. And some friction can actually be good. It can challenge you to develop new strategies, to step outside your comfort zone. But too much friction can really hinder your progress.
It's like that sweet spot, right? Enough challenge to push you, but not so much that it overwhelms you.
Yeah, exactly.
The article also brings up this idea of the hidden curriculum. What is that exactly?
Yeah, the hidden curriculum refers to those unwritten rules, the values, the expectations that aren't explicitly stated, but that are kind of embedded in the culture of the university or a particular program. And as a student, you have to adapt not only to the official curriculum, but also to those unspoken demands. And sometimes those can clash with your initial learning goals or your preferred ways of studying.
So it's like you're learning not just the subject matter, but also the rules of the game.
Exactly.
And it's not just the university as a whole, right? It's also the specific discipline you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. Different fields have different cultures, different values, different ways of doing things. And the student culture within those disciplines can also shape how individuals approach their studies.
It's like each discipline has its own personality.
Yeah, in a way.
All right, so it's clear that understanding how university students learn, it's much more complicated than just labeling them as deep or surface learners.
Right.
There's a lot more to it.
Yeah, it's way more nuanced than that. It's this complex interplay of all these different factors. And the article really stresses that to really grasp this complexity, we need to have a multi-layered perspective. Like, we need to think about the different levels at which studying takes place.
Okay, so what are these different levels of context that we should be considering?
Yeah, so they propose that we should think about at least three basic levels. So first, there's your general orientation. And this is kind of your overall approach to your whole program of study. Like, what are your initial motivations for being in university? How do you typically handle your studies throughout your degree?
Okay, so that's the big picture, your overall approach.
Yeah. Then there's your course-specific orientation. And this is how you approach a particular course you're taking or, thinking about taking. So within your overall orientation, there might be some variation depending on the specific course.
Right. Some courses you might be more naturally drawn to than others.
Exactly. And then finally, there's your situational orientation. And this is how you approach a specific learning task at hand. So like you're working on a particular assignment, you're preparing for a specific test. What's your mindset? What's your approach in that moment?
So it's like zooming in from the big picture of your whole degree down to the specific task you're working on right now.
Exactly. And the authors argue that not being clear about these different levels can actually cause a lot of confusion, both in research and in just trying to understand what's going on. So by being more specific about the level of context we're looking at, we can get a more accurate picture of how students learn.
Makes sense. We need to be mindful of the grain size of our measurements and analyses, as the article puts it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, are we looking at the forest or are we looking at a particular tree?
And this also connects to the debate about whether it's more useful to measure things like motivation at a global level or a more domain-specific level. Like, are you generally motivated or are you motivated for this particular subject?
Yeah, that's a good point. And the researcher Pintrich, he was kind of skeptical about trying to measure motivation in a very general way. He thought it was more useful to look at your motivation for a specific course or subject. But the authors of this article, they also make the argument that measuring these general orientations can be valuable because it can tell us something about the broader personal meaning that you find in your university studies. Like, why are you here? What's important to you about this whole experience?
So it goes beyond just the immediate task or the specific course. It's about your overall sense of purpose.
Exactly. And research has actually shown that these general orientations can predict things like whether students change their major or even drop out of university. Like, if you're not feeling very connected or purposeful in your overall study orientation at the beginning of your university career, you're more likely to make those kinds of changes later on.
That's really interesting. So those initial motivations and that overall sense of purpose, they really do matter.
Yeah, they seem to play a big role in shaping your trajectory.
It sounds like these general study orientations, they act as a kind of framework that guides how you interpret and approach your entire academic journey.
Yeah, exactly. They're kind of like your guiding principles, your compass, and they're often rooted in your personal interests, in what matters to you and what you find meaningful. And research has even found connections between these general orientations and how confident students feel about their future professional skills. Like, do you feel like you're developing the skills you need to succeed in your chosen field? And also how well they learn in different types of educational settings. Like, some students might thrive in a very traditional academic environment, while others might learn better in a more hands-on, practical setting. And these general orientations can give us clues about those kinds of preferences.
It's like they're shaping your whole learning experience.
Yeah, they have this pervasive influence.
And going even deeper, the article suggests that these general study orientations might even be a link between a student's background and how well they progress through their studies.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating area of research. So, studies have shown connections between things like your parents' education level, the cultural resources you had growing up, how your family interacted, and your general approach to university studies. So, it suggests that these fundamental ways of engaging with learning, they're not just personal preferences, they're also shaped, at least in part, by the values and norms that we kind of absorb from our culture.
It's a good reminder that learning isn't just this individual cognitive thing, but it's also deeply embedded in our social and cultural experiences.
Absolutely.
Now, as we start to wrap this up, I want to go back to that idea of how things become generalized. Like, how do those approaches that you might take in a specific situation, how do those become more general ways of learning?
Yeah, so basically it happens through this buildup of experiences. So you try different approaches in different situations, you see what works, what doesn't work, and over time, those initial ways of approaching learning can become more habitual, more ingrained.
So those early choices you make, those early strategies you try, they can actually shape your more long-term learning patterns.
Exactly. Like, if you consistently succeed by just memorizing, you're more likely to keep doing that. But if you find that that's not leading to the kind of understanding you want, you might start to experiment with deeper approaches. And research has actually found that looking at learning in very specific situations, it allows us to make finer distinctions within that idea of surface learning. So, like, a surface approach might be a deliberate choice in a particular situation because you're under time pressure, or it might be more of a coping mechanism, like you're anxious about the test.